Hey everyone, this is Michaela, the director at the Cameron University Wesley Foundation. The Wesley Foundation is a Christian community that reaches students, grows disciples, and sends servants. And you're listening to the CU Wesley podcast. So last week, we talked about the importance of turning inward, looking at our own heart through prayer to allow God to transform us so that we can be more like God. This week, our conversation is about turning outward. We are talking about the importance of theological education, not only filling our head with academic understanding of God and our hearts with good intentions, but also going to live out our faith. We'll do this by looking at the life and writings of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Since we're talking about theological education, we have a guest speaker from a theological school. She is an executive director from St. Pauls School of Theology, which is where I received my master's in divinity. We recently met on Zoom to discuss the importance of theological education from the perspective of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Here's that conversation.
Okay, awesome. Well, hello and welcome to tonight's podcast. It's going to be a little bit different because tonight we're not just talking about somebody who is dead and in the past, but somebody who's present. We're having a guest speaker today. So today's guest speaker is Dr. Tiffany Nagel Monroe, and I'll let her tell a little bit about herself.
Hi, Michaela. It's great to be with you and everyone who's listening. My name is Tiffany Nagel Monroe, and I'm the executive director at St. Pauls School of Theology in Oklahoma. So I'm the director of the Oklahoma campus. We have two campuses. We like to say we're in Kansas City, Oklahoma City, and anywhere you can be, just because of the nature of education these days. I'm an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church. I grew up as a Methodist kid in Colorado, but I've been serving in Oklahoma as a pastor since 2010 and recently transitioned in January to the seminary, where we get to really nurture people and empower people in their calling and through theological and contextual education. So it's an exciting place to be.
Awesome. And I'm so glad. I wanted you to share a little bit about St. Paul and seeking a degree in theology and any of that fun stuff. And I'm glad you picked the theologian of Bonhoeffer, because I feel like that's really close to his heart as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I received my Master's of Divinity degree, which is one of the theological degrees that you can attain through St. Paul's School of Theology. I received mine through St. Paul, graduated in 2012. And so I like to tell people I was a part of the Oklahoma guinea pig class when they did this expansion, and we, doing video conferencing and dual classrooms were so fresh and new and exciting. And so was a part of that journey in Oklahoma. So it's exciting to kind of come full circle and now be the director at that campus. But the theological education was something I was actually required to receive to be ordained in the United Methodist Church, but something I'm enormously grateful to have. Mm-hmm. So you can get a master's in divinity, you can get a master's in theological studies and a master's in Christian ministry. And there's a variety of different options. And St. Paul also offers a doctorate in ministry program, which is exciting. And so that's just the next level and really honing in and specializing on what you feel called to. But that theological education, I think, is incredibly important. So that we're able, whether we're in a central ministry, whether we minister from the center or the edge, so we're ministering center from a local congregation, or we're in an edge ministry, and we could be working through nonprofits and community development, but it's still ministry. Wherever we find ourselves in ministry, having solid theological footwork is really, really important. So it's taking everything that you've kind of read on your own, your calling, the exploration of ministry as vocation, to Sunday school classes and Bible studies and, opportunities in youth group and camp ministries. All these things come together to really inspire you and to fuel you into your calling. And a theological degree helps you go deeper. It's like peeling the onion, right? You start to fall. So as in Methodist, we are formed around Wesleyan theology, and we have this thing we talk about, the 3 simple rules. And I think the 3rd rule should be number 1. It's, do all the good you can, do no harm, and stay in love with God. And I think that do all the good you can and do no harm is kind of pointless if you're not coming from the right place. So you got to stay in love with God. You got to be in love with God. And we feel that calling, and we're energized, and we want to change the world and transform lives and really reach into people's pain. And we want to love them, and we want to lead them. We want to introduce them to Christ. And what's really important for us to do is to make sure that we're continuing to peel back that onion and understand Christ better, and spend more time with him, fall in love with the Trinity, fall in love with the Holy Spirit, really be guided in that. And I am so grateful for my theological education, because it took me down pathways I would not have otherwise gone. And it challenged me to think in ways I hadn't thought before, specifically theologically. I hadn't spent that. I've been in the church my whole life, but I'd never spent that much time digging into scripture, digging into theology, practical theology. And, there's so much to explore. And that's something that, I'm going to talk about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but I had no idea who this man was until I went to seminary. One of my professors, one of the theological offerings, we could do the theology of John Wesley, which I did. But then there was this offering of theology of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and my roots are and genealogy is German. And so I was like, well, that's a very German name. Let's do that. Let's find out. And it wasn't Karl Barth, and it wasn't, it was like somebody different I hadn't heard a lot about. And so I dove right in and fell in love with Dietrich Bonhoeffer. In fact, I joke he's my theological crush, because of the way he thought. He had such a value on education, higher education. He'd go on to be a part of the confessing church. He led an underground theological school or seminary during the time of the rise of the Nazi regime in Europe. And he faced all kinds of confrontation, and yet he focused on that theological groundwork. What was so important to him was Christology was huge. Who is Christ? Who's Christ in our world? Who's Christ to us? Why does this matter? How do we live out that Christology? He believed Christ was center to everything. And then out of that came one dissertation after another. And he got dissertations at a young, I think he wrote, and you'd have to look it up, I think he wrote his 2nd or 3rd dissertation by the time he was 24.
I know, I was reading that. He was really young.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah. And of course, he was privileged, and he grew up in a family that was surrounded by brilliant minds. And he was surrounded by a value of education and music. And his family wasn't regular churchgoers, but he found himself drawn to this concept of community and really felt drawn to Christ. And so how do those two kind of come together? So a theological education was really important to him. He would even come to New York for a period of time in the 30s. And that was pivotal for him. He was even invited when things got really wild in Germany. He was invited to come and seek safety with friends that he'd met in New York, and he decided that was not where God was calling him to be. So a big part of his Christology, a big part of his theology was he believed that part of being a follower of Christ, to embody what we were taught, meant that we suffer. There's part of that suffering. And so you see the suffering in the world, you see the crosses people have to bear, and you help them carry it. You are to help carry that weight in the world. And he talks about costly discipleship and cheap grace. And that was something that was remarkably transformative for me, this idea of costly discipleship and cheap grace. And we could talk about that more later, but a big part of that was, it means something to be a disciple. It costs you something, and you have to set yourself aside. You've got to do the suffering work of dying to self. One thing that he said that will remain with me as long as there's air in my lungs is, we are free from sin so that we are free for one another. And that was that community connection. You know, why were we saved? Why were we given forgiveness? Not so that we could selfishly hoard it, but because now we are free for others. And so to embody that Christology means everything I do in my life understands I've been given a gift I didn't earn. And thank God through grace, we didn't have to earn it. But that recognition of it meant that I'm going to live from that space and look for where's the pain point in my community, where are people suffering, where can I serve, where can I love, where can I be the voice in the hands and feet of Christ? How do I do that? How do I show up? And so that theology, I mean, he clung to it when most of us would run from fear of returning back to a Nazi invaded Europe. He said, no, this is where I'm supposed to be, you know. And that made me think of John Wesley a little bit. He has a prayer, you know, let me be lifted up for thee, let me be laid down for thee. And that was basically what Bonhoeffer was saying is, if this is the end of me, I will live into this in service to my brethren. I can't abandon them in this time for self. So yeah, his heart for Christ, his heart for grace, his understanding of what it costs us. But it all comes back to that value of a theological education. And without that, I wouldn't probably have known Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and his theology has been pivotal to how I've led in ministry. I mean, every congregation I've ever served knows that Dietrich Bonhoeffer is my theological crush, and they will hear about him a lot. You get a lot of Wesley and a lot of Bonhoeffer from me, but it's good stuff.
Yeah, he has so much that's worth reading. And that shift that he has from when he's younger to when he's like a part of a conspiracy to kill Hitler, like that's such a shift. And you have to take that journey with him through his writings to be able to understand, like, okay, how does a pacifist go and like actively work against Hitler? Like that is, it's such a shift, but you can see it in his writings, especially like you said, it's all Christ-centered. And he moves from a space of just being academic and prayerful and going to church and that stuff, and then also starting to live into it more actively. So yeah.
I mean, it's kind of a dicey phrase because it's used in many political ways. But, you know, I hope we can take that lens off for a minute, because I think there's something behind the phrase. So feminist Gloria Steinem says, you know, the personal is political. And what I believe she means by that, and how I see that in Bonhoeffer, is, you know, it was personal. He had loved ones that were being captured and taken into concentration camps. He was watching people who were part of his community, connected to his family, people who were family to him, were being horribly mistreated, killed, and marriages were being ripped apart, families were being ripped apart. And it was nothing that he understood to be anything about what Christ teaches us or who Christ is. And he was incredibly involved in the teaching of theology and the Lutheran Church, but he was very upset with how the Nazis, and particularly the Gestapo, placed certain rules and regulations on the churches at that time to control them, so that the churches did not speak out against what was happening in the political arena of Germany at the time. And, you know, that really limited what he was allowed to do from a political standpoint. And so he's watching his beloved country fall apart. He's watching people he's loved. He's watching young men who came up underneath him in theological studies.
Oh, yeah. You know, I heard a speech from one of his old students, like at the beginning, where he's like, oh, yeah, I was a part of like all the Hitler Youth and this social party. And then I also went to class with Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Like,
how
does that work?
Yeah.
I mean, Bonhoeffer was definitely a threat to the Gestapo, and he wasn't the only one, but that's where the confessing movement came from. And then the confessing church came from that place. But also, if we remember that Martin Luther, that the Lutherans are connected to, the Lutheran Church is connected to, is really had a strong theology of the cross. So that's present in what Bonhoeffer talks about again when it comes to suffering for the other. It's all for the other. So it's a lot of more of you, God, less of me, but more of my neighbor, less of me, right? So as he's teaching this and he's working through the confessing movement, he's watching everything fall apart. Yeah, he becomes a part of this movement to derail what Hitler was doing. And they eventually were plotting assassination attempts. And he was a part of that. And so one thing that what always struck me about him, and I really wish he was still alive to speak to it. Of course, I mean, he wouldn't be now, but like, I wish there was more. I wish he'd lived.
Yeah.
But to speak to that, how does a theologian and a man of God who, and a big part of his theology also was built on faith, as much as he believed in theological education and higher academics, he also knew that being able to quote things was not going to be enough. We could be as intellectual as we wanted to be, but if you didn't have faith, none of it mattered, right? And so, he leaned on faith an awful lot to be a motivator. So how does this man of faith then, who has such a deep understanding of Christology, get to the place where he's okay with being a part of an assassination attempt against Hitler, which we know was foiled? We know it didn't work out, and we know as a result he's put into a concentration camp and would be executed by hanging, sadly, exactly 14 days before 14 days before they cleared out the concentration camp and set people free.
Oh, wow. I didn't know it was that close.
14 days. Yeah, I think he was executed on April 9th, and I believe it was the 23rd when they set people free, when they came in and freed that camp. So in his imprisonment, there's a great book called Bonhoeffer and King, which talks about Dietrich Bonhoeffer and parallels Dietrich Bonhoeffer to Martin Luther King Jr. in their letters from prison. Both of them had that. Bonhoeffer had his letters from camp, Christmas sermons, and both of them fighting against injustice in the world from different vantage points. And they had similar paths in some ways, historically, if you do some study on that. But that book is really enlightening. But yeah, their willingness to sacrifice self for the greater good of other. I mean, they both knew that their lives were on their line, and they both knew that they were going to find heat and trouble for what they were speaking out against. So the courage and resiliency to do what they felt was right based on who they believed Christ, not just who Christ was, but who Christ is today. Who is Christ today in the world? And that was the sole motivator for both of their work, but particularly Bonhoeffer. So it'd be just fascinating to see the parallels.
It is weird to place some of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's writings. I think this is the first theologian we've had that isn't like in the 1500s in the medieval times. So you're pulling us back to real life. But then when you place it in a timeline, especially when Dietrich Bonhoeffer comes to America and the influence of the Harlem movement going on, like that was really cool to read about as well.
Yeah, right. So he went to Union Theological Seminary in New York and did some postgraduate work there, early 1930s, I think 1930, 1931. And he encountered this gospel movement and he encountered the people of Harlem, and it was very different from anything he knew in his homeland. And he was moved by it. He had this, I think it's a lot like John Wesley and encountering the Moravians.
Oh yeah.
You encounter these people who are so moved by the Spirit, and it's more than just, bookwork and study and the academy and these things, which are valuable, but we have this spiritual movement that's coming with it. He was so moved by what he witnessed, what was preached, what he learned, what he heard, the singing, the preaching, the teaching. And he thought, there's something here we're missing in the churches back home, right? There's something more. It makes me think of John Wesley being on the boat and just being like, God, save me, save me, save me. And you have the Moravians who are just like, thank you, Lord, for this boat. And thank you for this. How do you get to the place where you rejoice even in difficulty? And I think Bonhoeffer in that Union experience encountered faith through a different lens, through different people, and encountered Christ in a new way that just brought life to him. And what's fascinating is that was the early 30s. He goes back to Germany and it impacts the rest of his teaching. It changed him. He allowed it to change it. He welcomed this different culture, these different folks to really fuel him and to teach him theology by the way they were community. And that just further moved how he said our Christology cannot be disconnected from community. It's one and the same. So he would say you experience Christ the most through word, sacrament, and community. I think that's a lesson our world could spend some time sitting with today. We can't forget the community element of what we're called to, right? And that goes back to what he said. I'm free from my sin. I have freedom from sin so that I can be free for others. And it's life-changing. I think it changed my life, that concept.
Yeah, and I think we are having those same types of conversations when we feel that disconnect of church and like our Sunday morning services, that moment of like, hey, I love what we're talking about and what's going on, but I need to leave that here because it doesn't apply to the rest of my life. I feel like we feel that, but I don't know if we've really put words in it, at least recently. I don't think we have. So.
It was also you're right. I think something else that impacted him in Union was his encounter. He came into contact with Reinhold Niebuhr in that as well as a lecturer. And that was also out of that, he would later publish a work called Creation and Fall. So I'm inspired by how this theologian that continues to inspire me was inspired by other theologians and how you can see that lived out in his work. But it was particularly, I think, work in the book of Genesis that really spoke to him in that. And then I would also say, that later came back up too when the Gestapo had rules over the church, and he would push back and say, no, the Jewish texts of the Bible are beautiful and pivotal to our faith. But that's also something that he came to really respect and understand because of that encounters that he had in New York. Everything just reveals more and more of God to us if we're open to it. But I love it. He was always teachable and he was always wanting to learn. He didn't walk around with an arrogance of I have all the answers, but he was clear and certain in faith about that Christology element, who Christ was, and about grace. He was very clear about grace.
I like how you said teachable. And because I feel like sometimes our students they have all these theological questions. And I think it's difficult for them to speak with authority in areas with others. Because they still have all those questions about God, but they do know a little bit. I mean, we're having these types of conversations every Thursday night about theology. So these questions are really deep and we are discussing it, but it's difficult to have questions and also feel like we have answers. So I'm glad you said that Dietrich Bonhoeffer himself was trying to navigate that space as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think if we have all the answers, what do we need the rest of this life for? We have it all figured out. But I think life is an experiment in how much you're willing to learn from other people. How open are you to have the question? I think it's less important to have the answers. I think it's more important to have the right questions. And to always circle back to those questions. What courage and resilience of faith looks like is someone who is assured of who God is to them and their experience of that, what their Christology is, to wrestle that, to wrestle their own theology, but then to always stay curious. to talk to people of other faiths or other denominations, to talk to those older than you and younger than you. I have two children that are still in the home, but they're older teenagers. And so they'll come with questions about scripture or some theology or concept that they were questioned with, because they're pastors' kids, so people are like, oh yeah, well, what about this? And they're like, I don't know how to answer that. But they come with these questions, and they're questions I haven't pondered. I mean, it's just amazing what I learned from my kids or youth groups or young adults that I encounter every day have wisdom I don't have. And so we have to constantly be seeking to learn from each other. Each of our experiences of Christ, I believe, will be uniquely different, because all of the ingredients that make up our lives, our trajectories, nobody's ever walked, I think nobody's ever walked in the shoes we have. Nobody's ever going to take the next step that you are. You're the only one that's going to take that very step. Mm-hmm. And so in that same idea, how you've encountered Christ, how Jesus has made himself known to you is going to be uniquely different to you. And I can't wait to hear about that. I can't wait to hear about that experience. I can't wait to hear how you heard a song and this is what you got out of it, or this is where you felt the Spirit move, or these are the questions you're asking. I've told congregations, for better or for worse, for years, but I've said, don't take my word up for it. Study your scriptures, ask the questions. Don't, I'm not perfect in this. I'm still on that pilgrimage myself, but are you showing up? And what are those things that for sure matter to you? Is it your Christology? Is it grace? Is it, the forgiveness of sins? What are the things that really make Christ make sense to you? And those are the things you begin to build on. But the questions are important. So I guess my encouragement to your students is stay hungry enough to learn that you always have questions. Right? The second we stop learning it's a problem. So yeah, stay hungry for more.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for that lesson. I feel like we're coming towards an end of something. So if we are really hungry for that theological education, how can we go about seeking that? If you have answers for how to do that at St. Paul or anything like that.
Yeah. So, full disclosure, I'm going to absolutely hype St. Paul here because I think they're fantastic. It's where I got my theological education. It's where I fell in love with Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and where I fell deeper in love with Jesus. And I would say, even if you feel your calling, your pathway is not to ordained ministry or not to be a pastor, or you're still just unsure, you can get a theological education that will impact many fields that you might find yourself in occupationally down the road. So it's not going to hurt you, and especially when there's opportunities right now, like there are at St. Paul, to get significant discounts on tuition. Right now, St. Paul is offering 50% off tuition to start with. So your tuition, you're going to come in and get a master's degree, 50% off to start with. And then there are scholarship opportunities. And
I can speak about that. That's how I was able to go to St. Paul, because of all the scholarships available.
That's it. So, and there are foundations and people who are wanting to support. There's alumni. St. Paul has the best alumni. And so I would just say, if you're looking, you want to dig further into it, you have more questions, what are the degrees that St. Paul's offers? I would drive those who are listening to our website, which is www.spst.edu. And there are some pretty big links right when you get there. I think it's a pretty great website. So you'll be able to find all the information you need. Feel free to look me up on that website, or, those who have a connection with you, Michaela, feel free to share my email with them. Okay. I'm happy to answer any questions anyone has. Our director of admissions is Shannon Hancock, and she's also an alum and also fantastic. And so we would love to encourage anyone who's feeling like maybe I just want to go deeper. I want to peel this onion. I want to learn a little bit more. I want to learn a lot more. I'm hungry to go deeper with Jesus. This is a great opportunity to do that. We'd love to see you in Oklahoma City on our campus, but we have students from around the region. Now is a great time because of the position our world is in. There are lots of, surprisingly, a lot of people would be like, oh, this is a terrible time to get a higher education. No, this is a great time to invest in yourself while other people financially support you doing that. There are opportunities that exist today that did not exist when I went years ago. So do it. You don't have to come out of seminary in debt. You don't have to. And the other thing is people ask, well, what if I want to go into ministry? What does the job situation look like? Are there jobs? There are many ministry jobs. So not only do you get your theological education, you're going to come out of it having the network, the support, and plenty of opportunity for jobs where you need it to dig into where you want to. So yeah, why not? We need more people on fire for Christ and community who want to see the world healing and fight for justice and embody grace in all that they do. So yeah, check us out, St. Paul School of Theology. And again, I'm Tiffany Nagel Monroe, and I would love to talk to anybody about it who wants to talk about it. Now is a great time.
Yeah, I don't think there's any excuse not to go, especially with talking about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who started in a legal theological school during the middle of World War II. We have nothing in comparison to that. And he still lived and taught during all that craziness. So we're a little more calm than that, I think.
That's right. As an act of resistance.
I know.
So I don't know, as somebody who's motivated by that, I'm like, okay, there's a long line of people who are like theological warriors. I want to be counted amongst them. And I'm far, far away from the brilliance of Bonhoeffer, but oh my goodness, he's just one of many, many, many. We haven't even talked about the desert mothers and fathers yet.
Oh my gosh.
The Hildegard and all of the wealth that's there that I'm not sure I ever would have known had I not gone to seminary. But again, there's more than just the MDiv track. There's several tracks that you can go into, and people have gone on to go into education. They've gone on to get PhDs to teach theology. They've gone on to, just any form of education, nonprofit management. They've gone into the legal field. There's lots you can do with a theological education. So yeah, there's no reason not to. It's just, come fall deeper in love with God.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing. This has been great.
Well, you're welcome. And, I guess that's what I would leave you with. Keep falling in love with God and encounter people who have great stories to tell. That's what Jesus gave us. Jesus gave us a wealth of stories and wisdom, and Jesus is our all in all, right? So fall in love with the people who fell in love with him, and just watch how God grows you. It's pretty powerful. But thanks for having me, Michaela. And to anyone listening, you have friends at St. Paul's School of Theology, so just let us know how we can help you in your spiritual journey.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you to all the folks that helped out with tonight's podcast. Thank you to Reverend Dr. Nagel Monroe for sharing with us about Dietrich Bonhoeffer and about the importance of theological education. And thank you to my cat Theodore, who I just saw made a video appearance towards the end of the discussion. And thank you to all our listeners for supporting this ministry with your prayers and presence. We couldn't do this without you. We hope to see you on September 15th at 7:30 p.m. We'll be meeting at White Buffalo Coffee Bar. Check out our social media or contact us to get more details. And if you can't make it, be sure to tune back into the podcast, because next week we'll be talking about evangelism from the perspective of C.S. Lewis. We've all had our experiences of evangelism, some good and some not so good. Together we'll find a definition of evangelism that is both faithful to Scripture and something that won't make us turn and run. I would love to hear your thoughts. But until then, we'll see you later.